While I delivered a baby, the mother asked, "Where's your nearest trash can?" "Why? It's in the corner of your room." I gestured toward the small medical waste bin while cradling the newborn who was struggling to breathe. "Go ahead and toss it for me, please." She said it so casually, like she was asking me to throw away a tissue. "What? Ma'am, this is your baby." I held the infant closer to my chest protectively. "Look at it. The little turd is hardly alive. He can barely breathe. Just do us all a favor and throw it out." Her pupils were dilated and she kept scratching at her arms. "Absolutely not." I turned away from her and started checking the baby's vitals. I'd seen the track marks on her arms during delivery. The baby was born premature and underweight with clear signs of neonatal abstinence syndrome. His little body was already going through withdrawal from whatever substances his mother had been using during pregnancy. He needed immediate medical intervention, not a trash can. The mother started getting agitated when I didn't comply. She sat up in the bed despite having just given birth 20 minutes ago. Her hospital gown was soaked with sweat and blood, but she didn't seem to notice or care. The way she looked at her own child like he was garbage made my stomach turn. I knew I had to get this baby to the NICU immediately. His breathing was shallow and his skin had a bluish tint that worried me. Every second counted, but I also couldn't just walk out without following protocol. I needed to document everything and alert social services about the mother's request to dispose of her child. "I'm going to take your son for treatment now. He needs oxygen and monitoring." I kept my voice calm and professional. The mother's eyes narrowed. She looked around the room like she was calculating something. Then her whole demeanor changed. Her face contorted into fake panic and she started screaming at the top of her lungs. "Help me! This woman is trying to hurt my baby!" Her voice echoed down the hospital corridor. Within seconds, 3 other doctors rushed into the room. Dr. Peters and Dr. Burton looked between me and the screaming mother, trying to assess the situation. Behind them, Nurse Melendez appeared, looking concerned. They all knew me, but they also had to respond to a mother's distress call about her newborn. "Put the baby down and return it to the mother." "Doctor." Peters used his authority voice. "No, I'm trying to save this baby's life. She asked me to throw him in the trash can. She's not in a state to care for him." I held the infant tighter. The mother's performance escalated. Tears streamed down her face as she reached toward me with shaking hands. "She's insane. Why would anyone want to throw out their baby?" I looked desperately at my colleagues. They had to see through this act. The baby in my arms was barely breathing and needed immediate care. His mother was clearly high and had just asked me to dispose of him like medical waste. But the other doctors were looking at me strangely now. Dr. Burton stepped closer with his hands up like he was approaching a dangerous animal. "Gabriella, did you take your medication today? When we hired you, you promised to never miss a day of your medication." My heart sank. They thought I was having an episode. 5 years ago, I'd had a brief mental health crisis during my residency. I'd been properly diagnosed and treated for bipolar disorder. I'd been stable on medication ever since, but that history would always follow me. Now this manipulative woman was using it against me. I never broke that promise. I take my medication every morning. I'm not having an episode. I'm trying to keep this baby in the right hands. I could hear how desperate I sounded, which probably made things worse. To prove my point, I tried to hand the baby to Dr. Peters. If I couldn't take him to NICU myself, at least another doctor could. But as I moved toward him, the whole room erupted. Dr. Burton grabbed my arms while Nurse Melendez tried to take the baby. In the chaos, I held on tighter, afraid they'd drop him. "Stop! You're going to hurt him!" I shouted, but they weren't listening. Someone knocked my legs out from under me and I went down hard. My training kicked in and I managed to protect the baby as I fell, cushioning him against my chest. But then multiple hands were on me, pinning me to the ground. The baby was ripped from my arms and I could hear him crying weakly. "One of you call the police!" "Doctor!" Peter shouted while holding my wrists. Through the tangle of bodies, I could see the mother holding her son carelessly with one arm. She wasn't supporting his head properly. She was staring down at me with a satisfied smirk that only I could see from this angle. Then she started her performance again. "I'm going to sue this woman for everything she has. She tried to steal my baby. She's clearly unstable." She wailed dramatically. I stopped struggling and lay still on the cold hospital floor. 3 of my colleagues were restraining me while a drug-addicted mother held a newborn who desperately needed medical care. The baby's cries were getting weaker, his breathing more labored. The sirens got louder and 2 police officers pushed through the doorway with their hands on their equipment belts. Dr. Peters kept my wrists pinned while explaining to them that I'd tried to steal a patient's newborn and refused multiple orders to return the baby. The mother's crying got even louder as she clutched her son against her chest, without supporting his tiny head that kept flopping backward. She screamed about assault and kidnapping while the baby made these weak, gasping sounds that nobody else seemed to notice. The officers pulled me up from the floor and each one grabbed an arm to walk me out of the room. My scrubs were twisted and my hair had come loose from its ponytail, but I couldn't fix anything with their hands locked around my biceps. They marched me down the hallway past the nurses' station where everyone stopped working to stare at me being escorted like a criminal. The employee health office was 3 floors down, and the officers stayed silent in the elevator while I watched the numbers change. My badge got pulled off my scrubs the second we walked through the door, and the security supervisor told me I was banned from all patient care areas until further notice. The occupational health nurse came in with a clipboard and started asking about my medication while checking my pupils with a pen light. I told her I took my pills at 6 that morning, just like every other morning for the past 5 years, and showed her the reminder app on my phone with all the green check marks. She wrote down everything while the officers stood by the door watching me like I might try to run. After 2 hours of sitting in that small office with nothing to do but replay everything that had just happened, They finally let me leave with strict instructions not to contact any hospital staff about the incident. My hands shook so bad I could barely get my car key in the ignition, and I had to pull over twice on the drive home because I kept seeing that baby's blue skin and hearing his weak cries. That evening, my phone rang and my supervisor's name showed up on the screen. She told me I was on paid administrative leave starting immediately, and her voice had this disappointed tone like I'd let her down personally. She said it was standard protocol when police got involved in a patient complaint, but I could hear she already thought I was guilty of something. I couldn't sleep that night, so I sat at my kitchen table with a notebook writing down every single detail I could remember. The mother's exact words about throwing her baby in the trash played over and over in my head while I documented her dilated pupils and the track marks running up both her arms. I wrote about the baby's blue-tinged skin and how his breathing was getting worse every second we wasted with their stupid restraint. The next morning, my phone rang at 7, and Giovanna Carlson from Risk Management introduced herself in this fake friendly voice. She wanted to schedule an interview for tomorrow afternoon and mentioned I had the right to bring a union representative or an attorney if I wanted. After hanging up, I opened my laptop and logged into my work email, where I still had limited access to the hospital systems. The electronic health record showed the baby had been admitted to NICU with respiratory distress and neonatal abstinence syndrome, which meant they'd finally figured out what I'd been trying to tell them. An anonymous email popped up from a hospital account warning all staff not to discuss the ongoing investigation regarding yesterday's incident. The rumor mill was probably already spinning with different versions of what happened, and I knew my reputation was getting destroyed with every retelling. I spent the rest of the afternoon digging through my filing cabinet to find all my pharmacy records from the past 5 years, showing I'd never missed a single refill of my medication. Then I called Dr. Jimena Archer's office, and her receptionist squeezed me in for an emergency appointment the next day, so she could write a letter confirming my mental stability. My kitchen table was covered with papers and receipts and medical records by the time I finished gathering everything that might help prove I wasn't having some kind of episode when I tried to save that baby. The whole thing felt like a nightmare where everyone decided I was the problem, instead of the mother who literally asked me to throw her newborn in the garbage. I kept checking the NICU census online to make sure the baby was still listed as a patient, because at least that meant he was getting the care he needed, even if it cost me everything. My phone buzzed with texts from coworkers asking if I was okay, but I couldn't respond to any of them without violating the order not to discuss the case. The isolation made everything worse because I couldn't even defend myself or explain what really happened in that delivery room. All I could do was sit there with my documentation and wait for tomorrow's interview, while that mother's performance kept playing in my head. She'd manipulated everyone so perfectly, and used my mental health history against me in a way that made me look dangerous instead of protective. The baby was safe in NICU now, but I was the one being treated like a threat to patient safety. That evening, my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dr. Peters, and his voice sounded tight and formal as he told me to cooperate fully with the investigation for everyone's benefit. The way he stressed everyone made it clear he meant the hospital's reputation more than the baby who almost died. I replayed the message 3 times, and each time his tone got under my skin more because he didn't once ask if I was okay or mention the baby's condition. My laptop was still open on the kitchen table, so I started searching for employment lawyers in the area and found Luca Vasquez, who had good reviews for medical professional cases. When I called his office, the receptionist put me through right away, and Luca listened to my whole story without interrupting once. He told me to write down everything I remembered and save any documents I had, but warned me not to contact Nurse Melendez or any other witnesses because it could look like I was trying to influence their statements. The next morning, I checked my work email and found a memo from the hospital's PR team about a patient care incident under review that didn't name me, but everyone would know exactly what it meant. My hands shook as I printed it out and added it to the growing pile of papers on my table, because this was becoming more real with every document. I called Dr. Jimena Archer's office and explained I needed an emergency appointment, and her receptionist found a slot for me that afternoon, even though she was usually booked weeks out. When I got to her office, I sat in the familiar chair, and the words just poured out about the shame of being tackled to the floor and how nobody believed me about the mother wanting to throw her baby away. Jimena took notes while I talked, and her face stayed calm and professional, but I could see concern in her eyes as she documented my stable mental state. She agreed to write a detailed letter confirming I'd been compliant with my medication for 5 years and had shown no signs of any episodes during our regular sessions. On the drive home, my phone rang, and it was Luca telling me that news was spreading about the mother filing a formal complaint with the hospital and threatening to sue for emotional distress. The fact that the administration was taking her seriously despite her obvious drug use made my stomach turn because they saw her as less of a liability than me. 2 days later, I put on my most professional outfit and met Luca in the hospital's administrative wing for my first interview with risk manager Giovanna Carlson. She sat behind a huge desk typing on her laptop while asking me to describe exactly what happened in the delivery room, and I could tell she was looking for any inconsistency in my story. I explained about the mother's request to throw the baby in the trash and how his skin was turning blue from lack of oxygen, but Giovanna just kept typing without any reaction. The security supervisor came in halfway through with a laptop showing hallway camera footage that captured people rushing into the room, but nothing from inside where the actual incident happened. He pointed out timestamps showing I'd been in the room for 20 minutes before the other doctors arrived, but there was no audio to prove what the mother had said about disposing of her baby. After the meeting, Luca stayed behind to review my electronic health records and discovered my notes from right before the incident clearly documented the baby's respiratory distress and need for immediate NICU care. He showed me how the timestamps proved I'd been following proper medical protocol by documenting the baby's condition before trying to get him help, which supported my version of events. The next day, I got an email from HR reframing the whole thing as a breach of protocol about chain of custody for newborns, and they didn't seem to care at all about the mother's request to throw him away. Their letter used cold bureaucratic language about failure to follow established procedures and creating a disruptive situation that made me sound like the problem instead of someone trying to save a baby. Luca called me after reviewing the HR email and advised me not to reach out to Nurse Melendez or any of my other colleagues even though the isolation was killing me. He explained that any contact could be seen as witness tampering and would make things worse for my case even though all I wanted was for someone to back up what really happened. My phone kept buzzing with texts from coworkers asking if I was okay, but I couldn't answer any of them, which made me feel more alone than I'd ever felt in my life. The pile of documents on my kitchen table kept growing with pharmacy records and session notes and emails, but none of it seemed to matter as much as the fact that nobody believed me about what that mother said. Every night I checked the NICU census online to make sure the baby was still listed, because at least that meant he was alive and getting care even if my career was falling apart. The worst part was knowing that somewhere in the hospital that mother was probably still playing the victim while her baby fought for his life because of the drugs she'd pumped into his system. I kept going over every second of that day, wondering what I could have done differently, but every scenario ended the same way with me trying to save a baby, and everyone treating me like I was the danger. Security arrived within minutes and helped pull me to my feet while the mother kept wailing about assault and lawyers. They escorted me to the employee health office where I sat in a plastic chair for 2 hours, while different people came in asking the same questions over and over. The occupational health nurse checked my pupils and took my blood pressure while asking about my medication schedule. I showed her the pill reminder app on my phone with today's dose checked off at 6 a.m., just like every other morning for the past 5 years. She wrote everything down without making eye contact. My supervisor called that evening to tell me I was on paid administrative leave effective immediately and couldn't discuss the incident with any staff members. I spent the whole night writing down every detail I could remember in a notebook. The mother's exact words about throwing the baby in the trash, her dilated pupils, the track marks on her arms, how the baby's skin had that blue tint. The next morning, Giovanna Carlson from Risk Management called to schedule an interview and mentioned I had the right to union representation or an attorney present. I checked the electronic health record remotely and saw the baby was listed in NICU with respiratory distress and neonatal abstinence syndrome, which proved everything I'd been saying. An anonymous email went out to all staff warning them not to discuss the ongoing investigation. I spent that afternoon gathering 5 years of pharmacy records showing every single refill of my medication and made an appointment with my psychiatrist, Ximena Archer, for a stability letter. I found an employment attorney named Luca Vasquez, who agreed to represent me and explained my rights while telling me to document everything, but avoid contacting witnesses directly. 3 days later, I learned the hospital social worker had filed a mandated report to CPS about the baby's neonatal abstinence syndrome, which meant someone else finally recognized the danger. Luca called me the next week with news that NICU fellow Nathaniel Wagner had documented the baby requiring immediate oxygen support with high NAS scores in his admission notes. The medical evidence backed up everything I'd been trying to tell them about the baby needing urgent care. Then Luca got a copy of Dr. Burton's written statement to investigators where he questioned my judgment under pressure and suggested I might have misinterpreted the situation due to my history. Reading his words felt like getting punched in the stomach even though we'd never been close colleagues. The hospital council refused to release the mother's toxicology screen results when Luca requested them, citing privacy laws that protected her more than they protected that baby. We knew the test existed because it was standard protocol for suspected drug use during pregnancy, but couldn't access it without her consent or a court order. 2 weeks into the investigation, CPS investigator Milana Black contacted me through Luca, requesting a statement about what I witnessed. I spent hours carefully writing out just the facts about the mother asking me to throw the baby in the medical waste bin while avoiding anything that could sound vindictive or emotional. The security incident report finally surfaced, and Luca showed me how it was written in neutral language describing physical restraint of a staff member, but nothing about the mother's theatrical performance or her request to dispose of her baby. At least the report didn't paint me as violent or aggressive, which was something. I submitted my pharmacy records and Jimena's detailed letter confirming my psychiatric stability to HR, along with documentation showing perfect medication compliance for 60 consecutive months. Having all that paperwork felt like putting on armor against their assumptions about my mental health. Then Luca discovered the mother had posted on social media about a crazy nurse trying to kidnap her baby, even though she didn't use my name directly. The hospital PR team flagged it as a reputational risk and sent another memo reminding staff about social media policies. While reviewing Nathaniel Wagner's NICU admission notes more carefully, Luca found something important buried in the documentation. Wagner had written an observation about the mother holding the baby without proper head support during the handover from me to her, which meant someone else had noticed her carelessness with her own child. It was just one line in pages of medical notes, but it proved I wasn't imagining things about how she handled that baby. The next week, Giovanna Carlson sent a formal report reframing the entire incident as a process deviation in chain of custody protocols regardless of the mother's behavior or the baby's medical condition. Her report focused entirely on my failure to follow proper procedures for transferring a newborn, and completely ignored the fact that the mother had asked me to throw her baby away like garbage. The bureaucracy was protecting itself first, and the truth didn't seem to matter at all. Every night I checked the NICU census online just to make sure the baby was still listed, because that meant he was alive and getting the care he desperately needed even if my career was falling apart, because I tried to save him. 3 days later, Milana Black called through Luca's office to confirm CPS had received the mandated report from the hospital. And they were already developing a safety plan for the baby, which gave me some hope that at least one person in the system was actually thinking about his welfare instead of just covering their own backs. Luca explained during that same call that we couldn't access the mother's drug test results without getting a subpoena first, which would mean filing an actual lawsuit. And the whole process could take months, while the privacy laws protected her way more than they ever protected that baby who was born withdrawing from whatever she'd been using. The next morning, Luca's assistant emailed me copies of statements from several corridor staff members who remembered seeing the mother scratching at her arms and looking really out of it during admission, but the hospital's legal team had already marked all of it as hearsay, which meant their observations matched exactly what I saw, but carried zero legal weight in any official proceeding. Dr. Peters submitted his formal statement to the investigation panel that afternoon, and Luca forwarded it to me with a warning to stay calm when I read it. Because Peters praised my clinical instincts in one paragraph, then spent 3 more paragraphs criticizing what he called my boundary violations and confrontational approach to patient care, like he was trying to play both sides and keep himself out of any real responsibility for what happened. The CPS documents that Milana Black shared through proper channels showed the baby's NAS scores were staying dangerously high, and he'd need at least 6 more weeks in the NICU for withdrawal management, which meant all that suffering he was going through right now could have been prevented if they'd just let me get him to intensive care immediately instead of pinning me to the floor. Hospital counsel sent a warning through Luca's office the next day about not speaking to any media outlets, and they made it really clear there could be additional consequences beyond just losing my job if I talked to reporters, which felt exactly like a gag order designed to keep me quiet about what really happened in that delivery room. I spent hours that night going through my contemporaneous notes from the incident and comparing them to the electronic health record timestamps that Luca had gotten through Discovery. And everything matched up perfectly down to the minute, which he said would really strengthen my credibility when we had to present our defense to the review board. The NICU social worker documented that the mother had missed her first 2 scheduled visits to see her baby, and the staff just wrote it down without any commentary. But her absence said everything about what her real priorities were compared to all that dramatic screaming she did about me trying to steal her precious child. Late Friday afternoon, the security supervisor submitted a revised statement clarifying that Dr. Peters was actually the one who told them to call the police, not the mother, which was a small detail, but it mattered a lot for understanding how the whole situation escalated from a medical emergency to me being treated like a criminal. Luca called me that evening with more bad news because the Board of Nursing had received the hospital's incident report, and they might open their own separate investigation, which meant I could face additional scrutiny beyond just my employment issues, and potentially lose my nursing license if they decided I'd violated professional standards, even though all I did was try to save a baby whose mother wanted him thrown in the trash. The next morning, Luca called with news about the NICU documentation, and I could hear papers shuffling on his end. He'd gotten hold of Nathaniel Wagner's notes from that first hour after they finally got the baby to intensive care. The record showed the baby needed immediate oxygen support, and his levels were dangerously low when he arrived. Wagner wrote that every minute counted for preventing brain damage in cases like this. His clinical notes basically proved my urgency was completely justified from a medical standpoint. Luca said this was exactly the kind of evidence we needed to show I wasn't being dramatic or having some mental health crisis. I was doing my job trying to save a baby who needed immediate help. But then Giovanna Carlson called that afternoon with her own take on things. She wanted to meet again to discuss what she called a path forward for my return to work. I drove to the hospital administrative building and sat across from her in that same conference room. She pushed a document across the table toward me with this fake, sympathetic smile. It was a performance improvement plan that would require monthly reviews and supervision for a full year. The paper listed things like boundary management and de-escalation techniques I supposedly needed to work on. She said it was standard procedure after an incident like this, but the words felt like a slap. I needed improvement for trying to save a dying baby while his mother was high and asking me to throw him away. I signed it anyway because Luca said refusing would give them grounds for termination. Later that week, Milana Black from CPS reached out through Luca's office with questions about the incident. She needed specific details about what the mother said about disposing of the baby. I wrote everything down word for word just like I remembered it. The mother had looked at her own child and said, "Look at it. The little turd is hardly alive, just throw it out." Milana said having the exact quotes would help establish the mother's state of mind and intentions. She was building a case for the baby's protection and needed concrete evidence of neglect or endangerment. Meanwhile, at the hospital, I heard through Luca that Nurse Melendez was still avoiding any direct contact with me. Other staff members were sending messages through the union rep instead of talking to me directly. Everyone seemed scared of getting pulled into the investigation or taking sides. My professional relationships were falling apart, even though I hadn't done anything wrong. People I'd worked with for years were treating me like I was radioactive. Luca managed to get a copy of the police incident report after filing the right paperwork. The officers described it as a medical dispute requiring de-escalation between staff members. They noted I was cooperative once they arrived and didn't resist or act aggressively. At least the official record didn't paint me as some dangerous person who attacked a mother and tried to steal her baby. It was something, but it still hurt seeing myself described in a police report at all. Then we found out the mother had signed a limited release for her medical records, but she only authorized the hospital to share specific documents that supported her version of events. She wouldn't release her drug test results or any notes about her behavior during labor. She was controlling the narrative by choosing what information could be shared with investigators. Her lawyer was obviously coaching her on how to work the system. A few days later, Luca discovered something interesting in the NICU social worker's notes. The social worker had documented concerns about the mother's flat affect during visits. She wrote that the mother showed little emotional engagement with her baby and seemed disconnected. Other staff had noticed the same thing I saw that night, but now it was in writing. The mother would show up for short visits, then leave quickly without asking about his progress. The social worker noted she seemed more interested in talking to administrators about her complaint against me than spending time with her son. These observations from other professionals started building a pattern that supported what I'd been saying all along. Around the same time, Giovanna called with another proposal from the hospital administration. They would let me return to work, but only if I accepted reassignment to a different unit. They suggested the postpartum ward where I'd have less critical patient interactions. After 7 years in labor and delivery, they wanted to hide me away like I was some kind of liability. The unit where I'd delivered hundreds of babies and saved countless lives was suddenly off limits. They were treating me like damaged goods even though I'd done nothing wrong except try to protect a baby. I told Giovanna I'd think about it, but inside I was furious at the suggestion. Then finally some good news came when CPS scheduled a team decision meeting about the baby's care. Milana Black explained they needed to plan for his safety after he left the NICU. The meeting would include medical staff and social workers to determine the best placement. The system was finally taking real steps to protect him instead of just investigating me. I wasn't allowed to attend, but Luca could observe as my representative. The mother showed up to the CPS meeting with her cousin, who she proposed as a placement option. She put on another performance about wanting what was best for her baby. But Milana told Luca afterward that the team questioned her credibility. She'd missed multiple visits to the NICU and hadn't followed through with the substance abuse evaluation they'd requested. Her manipulation tactics weren't working on the CPS team like they had on my colleagues that night. They saw through her act and recognized the patterns of neglect and substance abuse that put the baby at risk. 3 days later, Luca called with news that made me sit up straight on my couch. He'd gotten approval from the legal team to submit parts of my clinical notes from that night. The notes showed clear documentation of the baby's breathing problems and blue skin color right after birth. Every vital sign I'd recorded proved he needed immediate help. Luca spent hours going through the electronic records, pulling out the facts that mattered. He found my assessment notes from 20 minutes after delivery showing respiratory distress scores that any doctor would recognize as critical. The timestamps proved I wasn't making things up later. Everything was documented in real time as it happened. He also found the admission notes I'd started before the mother began screaming. They showed I was already preparing transfer paperwork to NICU following standard protocol. The legal team couldn't argue with medical facts written in black and white. 2 weeks passed before I got the letter about my internal review hearing. The panel would meet next Monday at 10 in the morning to decide my future at the hospital. Giovanna sent a list of panel members, including the chief medical officer and 2 department heads I'd never met. They wanted me to prepare a statement focusing on facts, not feelings. I spent the whole weekend writing and rewriting my defense. Every word had to be perfect. I laid out the timeline starting with the delivery and the baby's obvious distress. Then the mother's request to throw him away. Then my attempts to get him proper care. Then the chaos that followed. I practiced reading it out loud to make sure I sounded calm and professional. Monday morning came too fast. I put on my best suit and drove to the hospital for the first time since that night. Walking through those familiar doors felt strange. Staff members I knew looked away when they saw me coming. The hearing room was small and windowless with a long table where the panel sat. Giovanna was there with her laptop ready to take notes. She gave me a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. The chief medical officer started by reading the charges against me. Failure to follow chain of custody protocols. Physical altercation with colleagues. Creating a disturbance that required police intervention. Each accusation felt like a punch to the gut. When it was my turn to speak, I stood up and read my prepared statement. I admitted I should have called for backup instead of trying to handle things alone. I acknowledged that holding on to the baby during the restraint created more chaos. But I kept coming back to one point. That baby would have died without immediate intervention. The respiratory distress was severe and getting worse every minute. Giovanna pressed hard on the policy violations. She asked why I didn't just hand the baby to another doctor immediately. She questioned my judgment in refusing Dr. Peter's direct order. She wanted to know if I thought I was above hospital protocols. I answered each question carefully. The policies existed to protect patients. But in that moment, the baby needed protection from his own mother. Following standard procedure would have left him in the hands of someone actively trying to harm him. The panel members took notes and whispered to each other. Then Giovanna pulled up something on her laptop. It was a memo from Nathaniel Wagner submitted that morning. He documented the baby's condition when he finally arrived at NICU almost an hour after birth. The baby needed immediate intubation and high-flow oxygen. His blood gases showed severe respiratory acidosis. His APGAR scores were critically low. Wagner wrote that any delay in treatment could have been fatal. His clinical assessment carried real weight since he had no stake in defending me. The security supervisor came in next to testify about what he saw on the cameras. He described it as general chaos rather than me being violent or aggressive. He said it looked like everyone was trying to do what they thought was right, but the situation spiraled out of control. He specifically noted that I never threw a punch or tried to hurt anyone. I was just holding the baby and trying to protect him when I went down. His testimony helped counter the narrative that I'd attacked my colleagues. After 3 hours of testimony and questions, the panel asked me to step outside while they discussed. I sat in the hallway for what felt like forever. Other staff walked by pretending not to see me. Finally, Giovanna opened the door and called me back in. The chief medical officer delivered the verdict. They would allow me to return to work, but with strict conditions. I'd have to work under a senior mentor for 6 months. Every piece of documentation I wrote would be audited, and I'd be reassigned to the postpartum unit instead of labor and delivery. It was humiliating, but better than losing my license. I accepted immediately, even though it felt like admitting guilt. Later that week, Milana called with news about the baby. CPS had made their decision after investigating everything. He would stay in NICU until stable, then go to a specialized medical foster home. The mother would get supervised visits only if she entered substance abuse treatment. She'd have to test clean for 90 days before getting any unsupervised time with him. The baby was finally safe and getting the care he needed. The police investigation wrapped up the following week. They classified it as a hospital disturbance with no criminal intent. No charges would be filed against anyone involved. It would stay on my employment record but wouldn't show up on background checks for future jobs. Small comfort, but I'd take what I could get. My supervisor scheduled a meeting to discuss the reassignment details. She seemed uncomfortable as we sat in her office going over the new restrictions. She mentioned that after 6 months of good performance, we could revisit returning me to labor and delivery. But we both knew things would never really go back to normal. The whole unit would remember me as the nurse who got tackled by security. 2 days before returning to work, I was leaving the hospital pharmacy after picking up some supplies when Dr. Peters appeared. He asked if we could talk privately for a minute. We stood in the parking garage while he gave the most awkward apology I'd ever heard. He said he might have misread the situation that night. He should have listened more carefully to my concerns about the baby. But he stopped short of saying he was actually wrong. The words came out stiff and rehearsed like someone made him do it. We shook hands, but the tension between us would probably never go away. 3 days later, I was sorting through paperwork in my temporary office when my phone buzzed with a text from Milana. She said Nurse Melendez had finally come forward with a statement about what she heard that night. I put down my pen and stared at the message for a long time. Melendez had been in the room when the mother asked me to throw the baby in the trash. She heard those exact words but stayed silent during the investigation. Now, weeks later, she was telling CPS what really happened. I wanted to feel grateful, but mostly I felt hurt that she hadn't backed me up when it mattered. The next morning, I started my new assignment in the postpartum unit on the 4th floor. The head nurse showed me around and introduced me to the other staff who already knew my story. Everyone was polite but kept their distance, like I might snap at any moment. My first patient was a woman recovering from a C-section who needed help with breastfeeding. I documented every single interaction in her chart with exact times and detailed notes. When I helped her adjust the baby's latch, I wrote down the specific technique I used. When she asked for pain medication, I recorded her exact words and my response. The hypervigilance was exhausting, but I couldn't risk any misunderstandings. Every shift, I triple-checked my documentation before leaving. I took photos of my completed paperwork with my phone as backup. Other nurses noticed my excessive note-taking, but nobody said anything. 2 weeks into the new job, I developed a system where I emailed myself summaries of each shift. The paranoia was eating at me, but it felt necessary for survival. 6 weeks after that terrible night, I got an email from Nathaniel at the NICU. The baby was finally gaining weight, and his withdrawal symptoms were improving. He'd been moved from critical care to the regular nursery, which meant his lungs were stronger. His foster parents visited him every day and were learning how to manage his special medical needs. The prognosis was still guarded because of his rough start, but there was real hope now. I read the email 3 times and felt something loosen in my chest. That afternoon, Milana called to update me on the custody case. The mother had missed several supervised visits and failed 2 drug tests. CPS was moving forward with termination of parental rights, which would free the baby for adoption. His foster parents had already expressed interest in making it permanent. Milana thanked me for maintaining professionalism throughout the investigation. She said my detailed documentation from that night helped establish the timeline and showed the baby needed immediate intervention. Without my notes, they might not have been able to prove the severity of the situation. Her words helped but didn't erase the trauma of being tackled and restrained. The following week, Luca sent over the final employment agreement for me to sign. After weeks of negotiation, he'd gotten the hospital to agree to protect me from any retaliation. My seniority would be preserved, and the incident wouldn't affect future promotions. The 6-month mentorship requirement stayed, but the documentation audits would end after 3 months if there were no issues. It wasn't a complete victory, but my career had survived even if my reputation hadn't. I signed the papers and tried to focus on moving forward. My therapy sessions with Dr. Archer became my lifeline during this time. Every Thursday at 4, I sat in her office processing what happened and developing coping strategies. She helped me understand that the system failed both me and that baby. We worked on techniques for managing my hypervigilance without letting it consume me. She reminded me that I'd acted with integrity even when nobody believed me. During one session, she asked me to write down what I'd gained from the experience. It took me 20 minutes to think of anything positive. Finally, I wrote that I'd learned to trust my instincts even when authority figures disagreed. I discovered I could survive professional destruction and rebuild. Most importantly, I'd saved a baby's life when everyone else was ready to look away. 2 months after the incident, I was leaving the hospital after my shift when I saw her. The mother was walking into the outpatient treatment building next to the main hospital. She looked healthier with her hair pulled back and clean clothes. A caseworker was with her, probably for a supervised visit with the baby. She didn't see me, but I watched her sign in at the desk. Part of me wanted to feel angry, but mostly I felt relieved she was getting help. Maybe she'd get clean and become the mother her son deserved. Maybe not, but at least she was trying. Every morning I put on my scrubs and drove to work knowing the truth. I'd saved that baby's life even though it nearly destroyed my career. He was safe in a home with people who loved him. I still had my nursing license and a steady paycheck. The other nurses might whisper about me and Dr. Peters might never trust me again. But when I thought about that tiny boy struggling to breathe in his mother's careless grip, I knew I'd do it all again. Sometimes that knowledge was enough to get me through another day. Thanks for letting me wonder alongside you through all of this today. It's definitely been interesting sharing these moments together. Take care. If you made it to the end, drop a comment. I love reading all your comments.